Hey, good morning and welcome back to docket number 240808, the Non-Wire Solutions Process Initiation Phase docket. We are here this morning for our third technical meeting in this matter, and we have an agenda in front of us today for today's roundtable discussion, hoping to cover a couple of topics. Brings us up to roughly noon. We will probably take a break around 10:30. But we'll wait to have a natural break in that conversation. So similar to other roundtables that we've been hosting lately, we are going to largely defer to Pure staff for the facilitation of the meeting, looking to the free-flowing conversation that we've been able to have at previous roundtables. So looking forward to that again today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Authority Staff Rory Butler to kick us off this morning, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair Gillette, and good morning, everyone. I'm Rory Butler with Authority Staff. Next to me is Steve Capozzi, who will also be helping to facilitate the meeting today. I'll go over the plan really quickly. Laura, could you put the slides up to the agenda slide? Thank you. So as the chairman said, this is the third technical meeting in this docket. In the last meeting, we discussed the system needs suitability criteria and the annual data filings. The plan for today is to discuss our first topic, which is the NWS solicitation process, including the standard RFP, and then move to our second topic, which is the EDC developed materials, such as the pro forma contract and the cybersecurity materials. These topics do overlap to a large extent, so we can be flexible with the discussion of the topics during each of the sessions. We'll have approximately 70 minutes to discuss each topic, and we'll have a 20-minute break between each of the discussion sessions this morning. We are conducting this technical meeting in a roundtable format, which is different than our normal Q&A. And that's really aimed at generating discussion among stakeholders and allowing for some more open dialogue. Pura's role is to facilitate that discussion and ensure that all stakeholders have an opportunity to give their thoughts on the topics, how they worked through them during the stakeholder process, and determine what issues remain unresolved. A few quick items for everyone's awareness and to make sure the discussions go smoothly. We're broadcasting this meeting live on Pura's YouTube channel, and the recording will be available after the meeting as well. The meeting is being transcribed. We have a court reporter with us today, so please identify yourself and your affiliation the first few times that you speak to help ensure that we have a clear transcript and to help anyone who is listening in remotely. Please make sure your microphone is on when you're speaking. You should see a small green light, and that means you're good to go. For today's meeting, we have representatives from each participating organization seated at the round table. These are not the only representatives able to speak today. The seated representatives are able to confer with other representatives or staff from their affiliated entities. Also, other speakers are permitted to be recognized and speak. So if a member seated behind our tabled representatives wants to come to the microphone, please do so at the appropriate time. Identify yourself and your affiliation, and if anyone in the audience would like to contribute to the discussion, please come up and you'll be recognized at the appropriate time. Again, the topics for discussion today are the NWS solicitation process and the EDC developed materials. For each discussion topic, first I'll provide a quick overview of the topic. After the recap, each of our participants will have an opportunity to provide a few minutes of opening comments on their position on the identified topics. After these opening remarks, authority staff will move to some questions to prompt discussion among participants, and participants will also be able to ask questions of one another as well. Okay, does anyone have any clarifying questions on the discussion format and the agenda today? Great. So before we get started on our discussion topics, we'll do some introductions. So please state your name and affiliation, and if you don't mind, I'll start with you, Attorney Wheel.
Hi, good morning. Tom Wheel from the Office of Consumer Counsel.
Morning, everybody. Vinicius Rossetti, System Planning, UI.
Good morning, Maritza Estramera Jimenez, United Illuminating.
Morning, everyone. Adrian Caesar with the Optimal Energy team and the Pura Process Monitor.
Cliff McDonald, also Optimal Energy team. Good morning, Gerhard Walker with Eversource.
Good morning, Lavelle Freeman, Eversource.
Morning, Dave Glady with Eversource.
Okay, thank you. Laura, if you could advance to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll give a quick overview of the NWS competitive solicitation process as it's described in the 17-1203 REO7 decision and the NWS design document before we move on to our opening statements and discussion. So real quick, just to establish where today's topic fits into the overall NWS process. At this point, the grid needs filing and the EDC recommendations have come in. Everything has been reviewed by the process monitor and scrutinized by other stakeholders. And PURA has issued the screening decision identifying the grid needs for which a competitive NWS solicitation is presumptively necessary for future prudence reviews. The REO7 decision established several procedural aspects of the solicitation process as well as requirements for the RFP. The RFP must contain sufficient information for developers to, first of all, provide proposals that meet the requirements of the grid need, and second, optimize the benefits to ratepayers based on the benefit cost analysis framework. So that information includes a standard set of data on the grid need provided to prospective bidders. It includes information on the process to qualify bidders as capable of receiving sensitive distribution grid data. And it also includes the minimum criteria for EDC operational control, including visibility and dispatch rules. The EDC will issue the RFP, and both the EDC and the process monitor will be responsible for promoting the solicitation process to ensure participation and competition. The RFP selection process will ultimately be run by and at the discretion of the EDCs. Both the EDC and the PURA process monitor will receive bids simultaneously. The EDC will evaluate the bids to determine whether they satisfy some or all of the relevant grid need and report the results of the evaluation along with the EDC's recommendation to PURA in the annual NWS proceeding. PURA will then review the EDC's recommendations, comments from the process monitor and other stakeholders, and issue a selection decision which evaluates whether the EDC complied with the NWS process and establishes a rebuttable presumption that any selected investments are prudent. Okay, so the subject of today's discussion is the Task 3 and Task 7 findings and recommendations of the process monitor, the process monitor's memo on the solicitation process, specific concerns that stakeholders have with the solicitation process in the standard RFP, and additional topics that were raised at the June 20th technical meeting, including whether in-service distributed energy resources should be considered eligible resources, and whether the EDC should provide preferential or accelerated interconnection treatment of NWS projects. So with that, we'll move on to our opening statements from each of the participants. So I'd ask if Eversource can get us started on opening statements. Thank you.
Of course, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Chairman Gillette, commissioners and PURA staff, thank you again for giving us the opportunity to speak here today. The company appreciates that the authority is giving us this opportunity and the forum to have these discussions. And after last technical session, I'm actually very optimistic that today will help us to move forward on a couple of the key topics, especially as we're looking at the topics today. I think with the exception of one or two items, there is a lot of alignment across the companies and the process monitor. What we hope to cover today, especially in the topic of the RFP and the company's EPC documents for procurement of the non-wires alternatives, is one of the most important aspects where we still see a misalignment between what the company's position is and what the process monitors and PURA's position is, especially in the end of who will own and operate those non-wires alternatives after they are procured. An issue which, as I mentioned, shows up in both the RFP and the EPC documents the company's prepared. This is an issue, as I mentioned, where we diverge from the process monitors and the authority's position. However, and I do quickly want to slot this in before we get started and that there's no further confusion down the line, the company does not have an issue with the ownership of third-party resources and operation of those resources of any sorts, front or the behind the meter, as long as those are not used for providing grid reliability services specifically. And so thinking of any merchant assets participating in energy markets behind the meter resources that are owned and operated for whatever other use case it is, other than providing grid reliability services. As I said, our concerns are solely with those assets that provide grid reliability services, and that's what we're hoping to go through today as we're discussing the documents prepared by the companies for this process as just outlined. With that, I'm looking forward to today's discussion and questions from Pura. Thank you.
Okay, great. Pass it over to OUI.
Hi, morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Again, we're being very honored to have the opportunity to discuss here in person all these technical sessions that this new model, it's pretty collaborative, and we are optimistic that in many fronts we can achieve many common ground and improve regulatory environment here in Connecticut. So for UI, we are also thrilled to discuss and to develop the best-in-class no-wire alternative no-wire solution process here for Connecticut, mainly considering the best aspects and real-world examples that we have from other jurisdictions here in US and also other countries in the world. I think considering things that work and do not work could that is seen that works and do not work could help us to have this very best-in-class, this productive no-wire process here for the state. What we would like to discuss here is about, I think we advanced, we have lots of agreements on many of the documents that we discussed. And one point that we diverge, and we, as UI, we strongly believe that it's one of the main aspects here is the ownership model, because we understand that for the electrification to happen, more things needs to happen, but two are very important: the affordability and reliability. And when we talk the ownership model, the way the DCs are proposing, we understand that the model is as much affordable as the third-party model that was proposed, and much more reliable. We understand that the DCs owning and operating these assets would ensure that we can keep providing and improve our reliability along the time to provide a better service. So looking forward for the discussions today. Thank you.
Attorney Will.
Hi, again, Tom Wheel from Office of Consumer Counsel. I don't think we have any concerns one way or the other about the solicitation process itself. I think the process makes sense to us. I will touch on, we've had some conversations, as I think came up in the REO 7 docket also, about this question of ownership and operational control. I think there are, I mean, like OCC is kind of ultimately concerned about the question of accountability. So like we're still not entirely clear on what exactly happens if one of these assets just doesn't run, or if there's an issue where an issue that we would otherwise sort of solve through regulation, not entirely clear on how we would resolve that without being able to regulate a third-party entity. All that said, not entirely clear to me that requires that the utilities own these potential assets or have entirely, not sure. I guess what I'm saying is I'm just not so sure it's as black and white as the only solution is for utilities to own and operate these things. But I am saying we are kind of intrigued to continue to have this conversation and kind of iron out the details of how this might work. But I think not sure if that's entirely in the scope of the solicitation process conversation we're having today, or if that's a conversation that's kind of further down the line. Either way, looking forward to it. Thanks.
Okay, great.
So Cliff McDonald, Optimal Energy, part of the process monitor team. Just agree with everyone else and thanking for the opportunity to be here with the discussion. We've had some good discussion in these meetings, and I look forward to some more. I also agree that I think the main point of disagreement that remains on this morning's topic is the issue of ownership. I think from my perspective, kind of looking into NWS processes and how they work in a few other jurisdictions, it's pretty standard that the EDCs might go to market for competitive solutions that they don't necessarily own the operators, or they don't necessarily own the assets. Before maybe or alongside potentially EDC owned constraints. I know there's even some jurisdictions I'm operating in where the debate is whether or not they're allowed to own any generation assets behind them. And I understand the concerns about reliability and et cetera, and they're very important. It seems to me like they can be solved and are solved in other jurisdictions through terms and conditions of the contracting. But again, just looking forward to understanding more about the specific concerns and trying to make sure that we arrive at a solution that works for everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you for the discussion. So I might, actually follow up with Attorney Wheel on maybe if you have a response or any thoughts on the opening comments from the process monitor in terms of terms and conditions and sort of the contract provisions addressing those ownership concerns.
Yeah, thanks. And that is my understanding from the REO7 decision that that's the control in place to control for accountability, the concern I raised before. I guess I'm just wondering, thinking about worst case scenario, I'm just wondering about if there's a situation where a contract is breached, the remedy there is like civil litigation, I guess, which is a remedy, but it doesn't fix the immediate reliability concern that's potentially a problem. So I feel like there should be some consideration of sort of whether it makes sense to have terms and conditions that allow for some sort of access or some sort of control in the event that the third party isn't able to perform. I don't read the REO7 decision to suggest that isn't the plan. So I hope that's responsive to your question. I think all we're saying is that we just want to make sure we really understand sort of what goes into these terms and conditions and that everybody's sort of thought out all of the potential outcomes that could happen.
Okay, interesting. And I might again kind of follow up to see if anyone has any thoughts on alternative ownership or operational control structures that would alleviate these accountability concerns. Yeah, Dr. Walker.
So thank you, Mr. Wheel, for the comment. So I'd echo what Mr. Wheel said. We understand that that's the intention of it is set up right now, that we're using contracts to basically ensure compliance with dispatch signals from the utility. But to also Mr. Wheel's point, where we see a lot of ambiguity and unclarity on how this is going to actually be executed in real time, is that these contracts don't conduct electricity. You'll hear me saying that a couple of times today. And I'm going to, just for the purpose of the exercise today, just pick an example. And I know I'm harping on the batteries, and I know there are other technologies out there as well, but it makes the most viable example. If we have a constraint at a substation and we were to procure a battery to support this service, and this battery is third-party owned and operated, if we request a dispatch for that battery, and notably, not all of those dispatches can be forecasted 48 hours ahead of time, right? There are unforeseen conditions on the systems, outages do happen, battery might need to be ready to call on immediately. And that's the direct comparison with the traditional asset, right? If we were to upgrade the substation, that capacity is available at all times without question. So if that were to happen and say that battery does respond, for example, but it was participating in an energy market before and is only at 25% state of charge because it was not expecting a call, then it might only be available for a very short time, after which we're running into a constraint. Or it might not be available at all, or it might not respond at all due to some technical issues. And so now the question begs itself, what happens, right? And yes, the contracts would allow us to go in afterwards and assign the blame, and you'd have that ability to go collect damages. That might bankrupt the company, and then you find yourself with an asset tied up somewhere in bankruptcy proceedings, and I don't even know where that goes down the rabbit hole. But even if you do collect those damages, that does not help the customer. The customer might have still been out of power, right? And so we're basically running into a position where in the event that this is successful and you have a lot of these assets on the system, the utility has to continuously run after participants that might not be fully engaged. And then even if penalties are enforced in the contracts, energy markets in the future might look entirely different. So if I'm an operator that can do good math, I might find that I can make a lot more money on the energy markets. And if I pay the penalty to the utility, so be it, I pay it, right? There might be events on the New England ISO where I just am willing to take the penalty and go into the energy markets. So that's the point for the control aspect, where we're very clear on having a control over those assets and being able to call upon them at any point in time to make sure that they perform. The ownership part of it is to ensure that they are in condition to perform. Right? So we operate and maintain our distribution system. We make sure all the equipment is in working conditions at all times. It's kept to a very high standard. Assets on the grid need to be able to be ready to perform under all conditions. For assets that don't have that, where that control isn't given, begs the question 5 years, 6 years, 8 years down the road, is that asset in a condition where it at all times can be called upon? Is that being maintained to the standards of the utility and that's expected by the regulator? And this goes back to Mr. Wheel's earlier point. To me, this has a little bit of similarities to the Restructuring Act of moving assets outside of regulatory control. Right? These assets would be third-party owned and operated. They would not be, and at least from my perspective, under regulatory control by PURA. They'd only be controlled through the contracts we hold with them. So there's no minimum standards that can be really enforced on maintenance on those assets, on availability of those assets. And like I said, even breach of contract, if the other hook is big enough in the markets, you might just end up paying for the penalties. So there's a lot more. We can go into different topics on this, and I'm happy to go into that discussion, but I wanted to stop there and see if there are any questions.
If I could please add to Mr. Walker's statement, do I have permission from the commissioners and staff to do that? So thank you for the opportunity. Good morning, Vincent Pace on behalf of Eversource. And I won't repeat the comments that Mr. Walker made, but I do want to add to those. I think it's important to just emphasize what the company is not opposing first. So we're not opposing the non-wire solutions process. We're collaborating and working with the process monitor to allow that to move forward. What's also important to, I think, to point out is Dr. Walker is not saying that we oppose third-party ownership in all instances. He said, for example, if a project meets the criteria and if it's energy efficiency or demand response or behind-the-meter solar or behind-the-meter battery storage, we're not claiming the EDC should assert ownership. What he's saying is in a very narrow subset of situations, when, for example, it's a front-of-the-meter asset and it's seeking to perform a grid operator's role of providing grid reliability services, that's where we have a heightened concern about the need to have the EDC be able to assert ownership and control for the reasons he mentioned. Now, what it seems to me from a legal perspective is we're putting a lot of faith in the fact that if you allow those types of projects to go forward, we're assuming that a contract can cure all problems. And contracts can be helpful, but they do have their limitations. And the example would be if instead of upgrading a substation or building a traditional poles and wire solutions for a localized need, we allow a front-of-the-meter asset to be installed. And if they go bankrupt, if they decide not to perform and do the maintenance, or if they engage in economic breach because they can make more money by selling the power into the grid as opposed to meeting our reliability goal, the court process is not a fast process. Maybe a year down the road, we can get monetary damages, but Dr. Walker's concern is, how does that meet the localized reliability need for that day, for that week, for that month? And that's the concern we have about relying upon a contract in this specific set of circumstances. The other legal concern we have, which we raised in our July 26 comments, are we're talking also about the EDC's franchise rights. So we were given by the legislature the franchise rights to be the grid operator in the towns that we serve. We're now talking about letting unregulated third parties perform an EDC's role of grid reliability. We don't see any authorization in the law to allow the authority to allow that to happen. In my view, this is similar to deregulation. For deregulation, we had enabling legislation that said the EDCs would be able to sell their generation to third parties, and we would change the ownership model. The underlying decision in this docket cited to 3 statutes, and in our July 26 comments, we said none of those statutes give the authority, in all due respect, the power to let an unregulated entity perform a grid reliability function, essentially being an electric distribution company. So there's a franchise right issue that we've also raised in our comments that's relevant here. And the last piece, and I think some of the people were commenting on this, and that is, do we really want to have an unregulated third party be performing an EDC's role of grid reliability? You have no ability to regulate them. The only recourse we're relying upon is this proposed contract between the EDC and the third party. So I hope those comments are helpful. I'm happy to take any legal questions. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. I don't have any legal questions, but I did want to ask how, excuse me, sorry, Steve Capozzi, Authority staff. If we're talking about assets for the wholesale market, on the wholesale market, how are they, so if they're privately owned, how is the grid operator enforcing reliability for those? And then how is that different than in the scenario you're talking about?
So I assume you're asking about generation resources that are participating in the New England ISO market. So there's a couple of differences here. First and foremost is that the New England ISO has access to a vast fleet of these resources and is not precisely requiring a single asset to comply, although they do that through contracts. But if a certain asset doesn't comply, they have always over-procured capacity, right? So that's what forward capacity markets are there, that they can correct for that. And if they have 1,000 generation resources and a couple do not participate, they can correct for that. The problem with a localized non-wires alternative, especially if we're thinking back to last time's discussion on the relatively small projects, the $500,000 project, those are very localized small items on the list. So if, for example, I'm sorry to berate the batteries on this one, but if we procure a battery for that solution, we don't have 500 batteries to fall back on with 10 of them not showing up, right? This isn't a percentage of appearance that we have here. This is a binary problem. The asset either is ready to participate or it is not ready to participate. That is also goes back to what Mr. Pace said and what I've iterated earlier is ownership of, for example, we're not claiming ownership of behind the meter storage because one solution could be you find 500 customers that are willing to put a Tesla Powerwall in. Now you have 500. Now we can again in the control mechanism say, well, it's a megawatt of behind the meter storage. We assume 20% don't show up because they're not fully charged or they're not properly working or whatever the problem is. We have 800 kilowatts we can account for. There, that math works, right? So that's a different mechanism. If you're looking at large front of the meter assets where in this procurement process, I don't see us buying 5 batteries, large front of the meter batteries to offset a need. In that procurement, in that scenario, you are limited to one single asset complying as it needs to do. And that's where the difference is. And that's, I think, where the utilities draw the distinction. Also in terms of how this operates compared to the New England ISO.
Okay. And if I might, Mr. Capozzi. So everything that Mr. Walker said really relies on the context of distribution operation versus transmission and the way the system is designed. As you know, we have an overhead, well, somewhat overhead, sometimes on the ground, but radial system. And when something fails on the radial system, unless we have the ability to reconfigure the system, customers lose power. And those assets that are there are critical to ensure that reliability. As opposed to a transmission system or generation feeding the transmission, which are fungible, they're replaceable. When one fails, others can pick up the slack. In a distribution environment, exactly what Dr. Walker just said, When that asset fails, it's in that location specifically for that purpose. And when it fails, we typically don't have a backup for that asset. Even if we're installing 5 battery projects on other feeders, those projects on other feeders cannot substitute for the one that failed on the feeder in question. And so therefore, it's a completely different operational environment, which is why we are so hung up on locational aspect of the distribution system and the assets performing where they are installed.
Just one more thing I think is important is just keep in mind those generator assets, like in your example, they fall under the requirements of NERC and the ISO requirements. So they're regulated by them. So if they fail to meet NERC standard, right, they would be accountable to pay the fines, not under a contract, but directly through those requirements. That's different than what we're talking about here.
Regarding the, you know, the localized need, and maybe there's only one, you know, there's this essentially one battery or something to address that. Isn't that often the case, like a contingency condition? So there's some redundancy built in, or is that not?
Yeah, so you're referring to.
Even in the case of,
Yeah.
you know, a localized solution through the non-wire solutions process.
You're referring to the N-1 essentially planning standard, yes. So, but
So just to be clear, on the distribution system, we don't plan for N-1. On the substation system, we do. So if there's a substation failure, customers should not lose power because they've designed the N-1. On a distribution feeder, when an asset fails, typically customers will lose power unless we have the ability to reconfigure the system. But we don't have that in every circumstance. Just the context.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And that's an excellent point. And so what I was going to say is, and that's correct, right? We're in N-1 condition. So I'm taking the substation example again, right? There's a 3-bank substation. N-1 says we look at loss of the largest transformer at the substation. Now, that also means if you always have an asset backing each other up, that if asset A backs up asset B also backs up asset A, right? And so so in the case of a substation where the battery backs up the substation, the battery is the backup to the substation, right? And so there is no further thing down the line that'll back up the battery. So yes, there is an N-1 standard, but the battery is the -1 backup contingency in that scenario. And we can go through multiple different scenarios of what that would look like. But as Mr. Freeman said, especially, I'm sorry to be harping about this from the last time, if we're going at the lower end project list for the low dollars, like we're looking at a circuitry conductoring, that might not be under N-1 at all. And then that asset, whatever it turns out to be, is the asset. There's no further backup on that.
And one of the, sorry, Mr. Capozzi. So recall those 3 projects that we filed in Connecticut. I'll use those as an example. So each of those 3 projects and the 2 that we filed were based on an N-1 failure. So in the substation, if we assume that one transformer fails and the second transformer has to carry the entire load, then it's overloaded. And then the battery is used to reduce that transformer. So the NWA is installed to alleviate an N-1 situation, just as Mr. Walker said. And so when it fails, then we're really at an N-2 if we want to design around that. And that's just not within our standards.
Okay, thank you. So I kind of want to maybe throw this question over to the process monitor about how this discussion plays out in other jurisdictions. If you're familiar with whether the ownership is kind of restricted to certain distribution system needs, as the Eversource team is saying.
So I can speak to that quickly. I was just looking at the other day in a presentation in another state where they were looking at a reliability project. It was a reconductoring of a distribution line, and they went out to bid. The utility in question went out to bid on potential of non-wires alternatives. Primarily kind of looking at battery storage solutions. They didn't get any bids in this case, so there were no kind of cost-effective bids, so they didn't move forward with anything, and that they are currently evaluating EDC owned model but you know, it was an item they're considering. In my experience, you know, I think maybe we're looking at the worst case scenario in terms of an asset a project that needs to be ready at any time to jump in and provide reliability. You know, that's not going to be the case with all NWS solutions. Sometimes there's going to be more defined situations. A lot of times, you know, there's only a use for it. You know, it's only needed a few times a year. And so, you know, but yeah, I mean, I think in my experience, from my knowledge, most other jurisdictions are allowing, you know, are looking at models where there's contracted as third party owned and operated, including in reliability situations. So, but yeah.
So I wanted to chime in here with some examples that we found with our experience. So about June of this year, I joined an EUCI training to help us develop and make our contracts more robust to ensure that we're covering ourselves, right? And as part of that, one of the presenters was a leader from Burns and McDonnell. They had a client who had a very robust contract, third-party ownership, a battery as well. And although they had that robust contract, that developer breached their contract because they were able to make more money on the markets. So they were getting penalized. They were able to make enough money in the markets to make a profit and pay for the penalty from that utility company. So that's our fear there, that we have these contracts in place to hold people's feet to the fire. But at the end of the day, if that was to happen to us and we don't have an N-1, our battery is the N-1, and we call for it, we might have a potential for customer loss. So we want to make sure that we mitigate that issue.
One thing that would believe that's why we as a DCs, we understand that we should, these assets we should know is to minimize risks. It's all about risks. I mean, it is possible to do, but we are, in my view, making the system more fragile. And expanding a little bit more about one example that we, as a company, Iberdrola, we were seeing in UK is about on the energy market, not on the grid service. It was on the energy market. But a couple of years ago, the regulator there of Gen, they understood that the market there is deregulated, and they understood that they should foster new entrants to enter the market there. And so they make some rules a little bit softer, let's say, for those small competitors, for other competitors to enter the market. Before that, we call the big six companies there, or the ones that control, let's say, the market. And what happened is that in the short term, the competition increased. Some competitors, they understood that they should operate in losses in the beginning, so they could gain market share and then start to balance their P&L. Others didn't understand too much how the market operate. But bottom line is that in the short term, the energy prices, it decreased. So regulator, everybody was happy with average lower rates of the energy. However, they didn't realize they were making the system more fragile because COVID hit and the war in Ukraine hit. Gas prices surged there in UK, and the biggest generation there in UK is gas, the base generation. So the electricity price surged. What happened? Most of these companies, they were like buying energy on the spot market and having fixed prices with their customers. And from night and day, they were operating in a huge loss. So what happened? Most of them went to bankruptcy in 2022. If I'm not mistaken, 30 or 31 companies exited the market. And those customers that they had couple of months, some years ago, a good rate, they were like operating on the spot market, and it was huge. So they see their bills increasing a lot. What happened is that the Big Six and other companies that had a more financial support, they come in, pick those customers. They were able to operate in losses for a while while discussing with Ofgem how to go next. And the end of this story is that there was consecutive rate increases there. Also some tax subsidies to not let the rates to increase a lot. So to the point is that there was a risk, maybe an uncovered risk there, or people were aware and they wanted to take that risk. And what happened? It was not beneficial on the mid long term for the customers there. So we understand this is a matter of mitigating risks. And so this is on the contract part. So how can you enforce a contract in a company that is small? Maybe they have like 1-2 projects, and if they go bankruptcy, the asset will be there. What will be done? We are, as EDC, we are going there and taking over the asset and start operating, or we would need to build some wired traditional alternative to supply that, to meet that need. So this is one thing about the contract. And another discussion that came that I like to bring an example, and this is from both Spain and Brazil. Those countries, they understand that grid services like reliability, capacity are one stream, and energy services, wholesale market are another thing. So they treat this separately, and they understand that they do not have like cross functions, cross interactions on that. An example for in Spain is that the wholesale market, the energy service, is completely deregulated. Loads of competitors, they are there operating on the market, buying and selling energy, and that's okay. However, for grid services, this is EDC's responsibility. So Iberdrola Spain has 2 major projects there called Caravacas and Rascafrias. There are one to improve reliability, quality of service, and the another is to improve quality, power quality. There was on the Rascafrias project, they have like a solar plant there, and on the region that the solar plant was, it was facing a lot of power quality issues, and this battery came. The EDC operating that, owning and operating this asset to improve power quality. And more or less in the same line in Brazil, the regulation there is on this topic is lagging behind a little bit from European countries and some states here in the US, but it happens more or less the same. It was a concern for the regulator that EDCs could want to play on the wholesale market, but step by step, we show them that it was actually not true. And what happened, Resource was discussing about transmission here, but what happened there, there's a major transmission operator there. They, in a coastal service area, they needed to upgrade substations and a transformer and a line to meet the demand for these coastal cities. And they study a non-wire alternative, putting a 30 megawatt and 60 megawatt hour battery instead of the transmission line upgrade and the transformer replacement. And it was like $30-40 million investment that was made by the transmission operator, and it's in operation for 1 year and something around there. And the company that I used to work there as well, we were able to go to ANEEL, which is the regulator there in Brazil, to present a reliability project for more or less a coastal area distribution, so less power. But we were granted this investment. So we're not saying that we should own for in any reason. I think this process that we are discussing here, the no-R solution process, the idea to have a robust, a well-defined process is to ensure that things are transparent, they are clear to stakeholder costs, both costs for doing the solution and cost and benefits, sorry, they are put there together in a transparent and a good way, so we can show that each of the projects, which one are the most affordable, and then on actually owning and operating the asset, we understand that we are able then to mitigate unnecessary risks by owning those assets that other jurisdictions across such Brazil and Spain for grid service, it is allowed. So some examples that we are seeing worldwide.
Thank you, Mr.
that could comply.
Rossetti. I think
Thank you.
we might want to move the discussion along a little bit. So I might ask if anyone wants to respond to that, or if anyone has any additional comments they want to make on this topic.
On the off chance that I'm going to take 2 minutes for this, yes. And I do, I apologize, but I do want to move this also a little bit away of just the topic of performance when called upon, right? That is one aspect of the discussion, but we shouldn't just get bogged down on that one topic. So there's a couple of other items that I just do want to bring to your attention on this. So in one isolated, well, not isolated, but one key topic is cybersecurity on this, right? So dispatchable assets on the grid. We have our SCADA systems. We can control, we can see, and we can monitor our distribution system. Again, sorry for the batteries here, but they're just my example. Let's assume we're 10 years down this process and you have 30, 40, 50 third-party owned and operated batteries on the system. That gives you 30, if that's all different vendors or it's a subset of vendors, gives you very different attack vectors on the system. Not each of those vendors is as well equipped as the utility to maintain cybersecurity. Those assets become a cybersecurity threat to the company and its operations. Now, every one of those vendors now needs to adhere to the cybersecurity standards. Again, being outside of regulatory control, the only way for us to enforce that is via contracts. So that just increases the possible attack vector on those assets, and it still increases the risk to the ratepayers and to the customers because they're outside of what we can control physically and what we can regulate on this. So that's the cybersecurity aspect. But I do want to also pick up on what Mr. Rossetti had said about the Optum example. I'm going to bring this back to these NWS assets and take the example I just made. Say we're 5 years in the future. There are 40-some assets out there, different substations. The first thing we can't control is who owns those after contract is issued. Let's assume developer XYZ bids in, they get the contract, they build it, they operate it. Next time around, they get bought up by a big bank. And somebody's diversifying their portfolio and buying up the ER developers. We have absolutely no control over who buys that asset. This could be somebody local, or this could be international. You could have these assets ending up in third parties across the globe and in other nations' hands that then have operational control over your grid reliability assets. That might not even care about the contract penalties in that. That's one point. So that's just, we're not talking about a single asset here. This is a mechanism that's going to roll out. And this is why I said this reminds me a bit of the deregulation aspect, the restructuring topic. This is going to have long-term consequences. And you're going to find yourself in a position where all of those assets are then third-party controlled in various ownership models that get resold across the globe. Very hard to control. And it also does one thing, and I think that needs to be very clear. In the end, it does take part of the distribution system cost, again, out of regulatory control. Yes, we'll take the cheapest option when we bid. But 10 years down the road, when the contract runs out and the capacity need is still there and the non-wires alternative is there, nobody is stopping that vendor from ratcheting up the prices for complying. Right? The contract runs out at some point, they can renegotiate, they can ratchet up the price. We're so far out of position, new substation takes 5-6 years. We can't respond in time to do that upgrade. So now they have unilateral price control over those services. So you're going to find yourself in a position with multiple companies out there that can have control over the prices. And now we're already, under pressure for general energy prices, but we're moving more assets out of the control where we can manage those prices long term. So that's just another aspect that I really do want to highlight. And that's not just about the single asset, one asset on this. It's about the total program and what's being maintained in control. And then my question to this is, I get the point that this exists, right? And there might be some additional benefits of third-party ownership. But at what is the benefit and at what price? Because the utilities, as we mentioned, we're not opposing to this process. We're not opposing going out for a bid for the cheapest asset. Whoever can build this, 2 specs at the cheapest, go for it. Excellent. So that benefit is captured no matter who owns the asset, right? So let's be very clear, this RFP process and finding the cheapest bidder, that's not in question here. That's captured. So what is the benefit of that asset retaining in third-party control and ownership, opposed to all the risks from Mr. Wheel at the OCC and the utilities have mentioned, with them staying in third-party ownership afterwards? And that's the big point here that we're trying to make. That benefit, let's go get it. Let's go get the bids. Let's make this happen. Let's get the cheapest solutions. But hand them over into the utilities control. That way they're utility assets, they're under regulatory control. We have clear visibility and ownership, and we can manage them. Sorry.
And if I could have latitude with the commissioner's permission to very briefly, and I promise I'll be concise because I realize we've had a very detailed discussion on this, but I will say this is the single biggest issue that we talk about for this docket for the reasons they've mentioned. When Mr. Capozzi asked Mr. McDonald the question of, what about other jurisdictions? And I heard the answer Mr. McDonald gave was, he said, there are some other jurisdictions where the EDCs are doing this. So as you take that piece of evidence in consideration, I'd like you to think about the following factors, please. And that would be, those EDCs may have been ordered to do it and decided not to appeal the PUC's decision. Or maybe they had no right to take an appeal. Another relevant question would be, what do the enabling laws look like in those other jurisdictions? Do those other states give the PUC the authority to allow third parties who are not regulated to own front-of-meter assets performing a grid reliability function? In all due respect, we've laid out in our July comments, we don't think that authorization exists here in Connecticut. Also, what do the franchise rights look like in those other jurisdictions? There may be differences. And a final point we think for consideration would be, here in Connecticut, the PUC has said, PBR is very important to you. You want to hold us accountable if we fail to meet certain metrics. One of those would be reliability and resiliency. So how can that ownership model coexist with PBR? If you're saying under a PBR framework, we want the EDCs to be held accountable if they don't deliver safe and reliable service, how can that coexist with third-party, unregulated entities owning front-of-meter assets performing a grid reliability function? In our view, they can't coexist. And so to be consistent with PBR, we respectfully ask you to consider the ownership model we're advocating, which is if the NWA is being selected to perform a grid operator, grid reliability function, let the EDC own that and hold them accountable for reliability in a PBR framework. So thank you for giving me the chance to offer those additional comments. I appreciate it.
Okay. Attorney Wheeler, you have a comment?
I did. Sorry, I saw you were going to move on. I just wanted to add, although, as I said in the beginning, we are concerned about accountability and risks and a lot of the stuff that's been talked about for third parties. But I did want to add that from my perspective, at least, EDCs aren't immune from these risks, and neither is the state immune from the risk generated by EDCs. I mean, like technical failures can happen for the EDCs. Also, EDCs, as Attorney Pace just raised, essentially the model is the EDCs only perform to the extent they agreed to perform, to the extent they think that the law requires it. And sometimes, as we've seen recently, the EDCs here in Connecticut have decided that they just aren't going to perform if they're not, if performance isn't lucrative enough for them in the sake of in the context of the EV program. We also have companies announcing that they're going to be cutting back on investments here in Connecticut because it's not lucrative enough. So a lot of this stuff, if you zoom out far enough, that's not that different from a third party deciding that it doesn't want to comply with its contractual provisions because it can make money doing something else. I just wanted to add, we already have assets here in Connecticut owned by an international company. So every time that comes up, I'm not sure like what the point is. I certainly agree with the importance of cybersecurity, but just the idea that an international company owning and controlling electric distribution assets here in Connecticut, given that 20% of our assets are already in that situation, I'm not sure I totally recognize the relevance. Thanks.
I have a comment on this, Mr. Will. Well, we understand that we are owned by a foreign company that go through a very extensive process, both in state and federal levels, to be allowed to operate and make business here. And as Ms. Gerhard said, these developers, they won't have the scrutiny that EDCs pass through. So I think it's a major difference here.
Okay, thank you everyone for the discussion. I think we're gonna go ahead and move on to some of the additional topics. We have a couple areas to cover. So thank you very much for the discussion. So the first set of questions I have to kind of prompt discussion among the stakeholders is on the solicitation process timeline. I think stakeholders generally seem to say that a timeline of 3 to 5 months was sufficient, with the caveat that the EDC should be able to extend the timeline for complex projects. So my first few questions are kind of geared toward the flexibility that the EDCs would have to extend project timelines. Would those timelines be set at the outset of the RFP? Would the EDCs be able to extend the timeline of the RFP after it has been issued? Yeah, I'd like to hear from stakeholders on that.
Well, I can quickly get started. I think there's a bit of a TBD on this. But also, if you look at like standard procurement practices, what we see is that a lot of the delays also comes from the bidding end. Bidders requesting additional time to submit, more questions coming in, etc. And as projects get more complicated, as you've just mentioned, those timelines might expand, where bidders require more information. They need to go, if you're bidding in, again, a battery, you might need to do site visits. You might need to, find properties to put that battery on. Like all of that negotiation might take time in order to complete a bid upfront. So it is very well possible that these delays, in all likelihood, come from the bidding entities, not from the EDC side, because most of the work in that process ends up being on the bidding's entity.
So yeah, just agreeing with Dr. Gerhard or Dr. Walker, sorry. Just agreeing with him there, I think we would like to see some flexibility particularly if requests are coming on the bidding end, bidders requesting for more time in complex projects. Just having the flexibility there to extend, as long as it's not going to kind of compromise the project, makes sense.
And just to echo what's been said previously, so in New York, as we all know, NYSEG, our sister company, has the Stillwater project, and in that project, it took us about 5 months to basically go through the RFP process, but it was more so to ensure, and we gave additional time to developers to provide a good comprehensive proposal so that by the time we were able to review it, it minimized the back and forth between, the EDC and the developer to make sure that this solution was actually viable. So we did commit to the 3-month on an average, but certainly wanted that flexibility just in case we have a situation like we did in New York occur here.
But it also raises then one question on the timeline that we talked about it on the last technical session, like projects a year out, 2 years out. So to kind of bring this back in complex projects, right, when the RFP process can extend based on the requirements from the bidding entities, for the authority, because there's some cutoff limits at some point, because at some point the EDCs need to be able to say, okay, this isn't happening fast enough. And if the bid process is already extending this far, we don't even want to go into what's going to happen in engineering. We need to get this project off the ground. So there need to be some dead stops in there that the utilities can pull if this expands too long. Granted, not if it is on the bidding side, right? If the bidding side is expecting more and more and more delays, that we can pull the plug and proceed forward with a traditional solution. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves in a position where we don't have a solution in hand.
Okay, great, thank you. And I wanted to also raise for consideration the idea that just for the sake of transparency, should timelines be extended, whether there should be any notice or justification or explanation provided in the annual proceeding and what form that might take.
So I'm not a procurement expert, but for the projects that I've been involved in, those didn't have that annual reporting requirement, but we typically do give notice to the bidders that there is an extension and what the reason is. And I don't foresee a problem of keeping that note and then attaching it at the end of the year to the report.
Okay.
Just one comment, super quick. I will say, in terms of the timeline, our annual filing would be filed February 8th. So there might be an instance where we're doing a competitive solicitation later out in the year. So in that case, what I would propose is that while the EDCs are communicating to the developers, that we also notify the process monitor so that everyone is abreast of, hey, we ran into some issues in this specific RFP. We're going to need to extend the timeline.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other comments on that topic, I'll move on to a question around the evaluation criteria. Could stakeholders explain whether the EDCs should release their evaluation criteria to prospective bidders, and also comment on whether there was consensus on this issue during the process initiation phase, and if not, why?
I can quickly go first. So I think that might be another one of the topics where I don't see it as being a big issue, but where there wasn't 100% alignment, the companies had opted to not release those criteria. That's just standard business practice. We do not release evaluation criteria on any form of RFP we do, because it would allow bidders to game the response, right? We want them to be as transparent and as forthcoming in their response and put their best foot forward and not gear that response specifically to what they know we're looking for. So nowhere in our procurement practices do we publish those criteria. So doing it here would be a departure from the industry norm.
Sorry. I agree with what Mr. Walker mentioned. I did want to elaborate a little bit more. So throughout the process, when we were reviewing and editing the competitive solicitation template, we did have discussions and we did indicate that we would be willing to release the review matrix to PURA and to the process monitor. And as part of that negotiation, we also ended up increasing the comprehensiveness of each category that is in the scoring matrix. What we're very adamant about not releasing are the weights for each of those categories. So just wanted to make that clear distinction. It wasn't, we don't want to do it. we're okay providing it to Pure and the process monitor and providing additional information to the developers. The weights are our issue.
Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, so just again, I don't know that this is as important an issue as some others, especially given that, you know, the release of the criteria. I'm a little confused by the argument that it's somehow, you know, less transparent for the bidders to see the evaluation criteria and the scoring criteria. You know, I think in my perspective, it allows better bids and it allows kind of a more fair process, especially in a process where it's envisioned that potentially third-party bids might be competing with bids from EDC affiliates and EDC developed and owned solutions. You know, it seems kind of in the interest of transparency and fairness to release these, and it also kind of seems that it would encourage better bids because the bidders would know exactly what your needs are and what you're weighting the most highly. You know, in the RFPs that we've reviewed as part of this process and through other projects, you know, most do include evaluation criteria. You know, some include weights, some include not. You know, I know just from my experience as a consultant responding to RFPs, you know, most RFPs are including the evaluation. Most, not all, but most do include evaluation criteria. And, you know, I think that helps with producing a better bid in general.
So just a very brief comment on my side. So having been on the other side, putting in bids for a couple of years, like, and I'm going to take this example, if the evaluation criteria says that 50% of the weighting is the cost, I'm overstating this. As a bidder, I would try to drive down my cost as far as humanly possible, which everybody's gone through an RFP process at some point. If that happens, you're stuck with change orders in the end and the process gets more and more expensive. And so that motivates certain behaviors in the bid. Whereas if that is unclear, whether how highly, for example, the cost part is mentioned, the company's more incentive to make sure that its bid is fairly priced, but not so low that it does need to come back for more money later on. So that's just like where I see this information skewing the bids. And that's why I said the companies typically do not release in any form of RFP their weighting criteria.
Can I have a quick follow-up just for clarity on that? Would you be envisioning kind of releasing to the bidders any kind of indication of like the deferral value of the like wired solution so just so they know, you know, whether order of magnitude, whether their solution can be so accepted?
I get the appeal for that, but I mean, again, so I say we have a massive substation trying to defer with a lot that put a number out, $20 million deferral value. And the bid could be $6 million, but now they know that they can go up to 20, right? So there is always that's the opposite side of it. Yes, I entirely agree that the vendor will have more clarity if they have kind of a range of where they're going. But again, in no other procurement do I go out and tell the vendor, I've got $3.5 million to spend on this, you better be under it. We want them to look at the scope and come up with a solution at the best cost. Because if we're wrong in that cost estimate, the $3.5 million that we're willing to spend, they might price it at 3.4 and walk away with $1 million margin on this. And if the intention of the program is to find the lowest cost solution, I wouldn't encourage that. So that's the downside, right? Yes, you're right. There are some benefits. Some bidders might put a bid in that had they known they would have never put in because they're outlandishly high. But that's the risk on the bidder's side, right? That's what the bidder always knows going in. And if you have a good bidding team as a commercial vendor, they're pretty good at gauging what that is. And since we already have to release in the RFP the capacity information and the amount of capacity that's needed, they can do a pretty good, decent estimate of what, they're all system engineers, of what that might be.
I guess the biggest downside to not releasing is just you scare off bids that you could scare off potential bidders because they just don't know. If you I've seen it both ways. Again, in RFPs, I've seen both, it both ways, either included or not.
Yeah, if I could add, at least in our cross-jurisdictional scan, it was a bit of a spectrum. For instance, in Hawaii, they had released what they called, the non-cost components of the evaluation criteria. So, they didn't reveal to the bidders how much the cost would factor into the bids. But it provided just some more transparency again on how, they should craft their proposals, and did result in some better proposals.
And yeah, I might also have just a follow-up question on in terms of whether if the solicitation is robust and competitive and there are a lot of vendors, whether that kind of changes or your concern about vendors kind of like inflating the cost up to the deferral value, because that might carry with it also the risk of not offering the lowest cost solution. Or yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to let UI speak to this, but because you've done RFPs before, how many vendors do you typically get on a bid?
So we distribute our RFPs, all our competitive solicitations using that developer list that we referenced in prior tech meetings to about 3,000 developers. However, we get on average about less than 10 developers responding.
So in a nutshell, I think it's a very niche amount of developers that are going to go for this, because it does carry a lot more weight than just building a DER for market purposes, right? So you need to be able to put that up. You need to be able to have the manpower, the financial backing, and get all of that done. So yeah, I don't expect us to have massive amounts of bids into these.
Okay, great. I think that kind of leads nicely into another question I have actually, which is I'm wondering if the EDCs could kind of elaborate on this list of developers that they've mentioned and kind of explain why the entities in that list are kind of relevant and promising opportunities, and explain kind of maybe where that list comes from.
Definitely. So that list has been vetted and it really originated from our sister company, NYSEG and RG&E. They've been doing NWAs for a very long time. And so now as a company, Avangrid, we manage that list and we release that. We update it consistently. So we have our email addresses on our NWA websites on our respective utility companies. So we get periodic developers contacting us to be part of that list. So it's consistently getting updated. On that list, we have a variety of different developers. So solar generators, battery generators are the biggest ones on there. We also have geothermal heat pumps. There's no exclusion. If they reach out to us and tell us, hey, we want to be considered for your upcoming solicitations, we'll put them on the list.
Okay, great. And so so is that list really only for UI, or Eversource you working on under a similar list of developers?
That list is something that we're actually working on together. So Eversource would have access to it. And I will be very explicit. The reason why we are sharing this list with Eversource is because we're both under an NDA with each other. We have gotten in trouble in New York for releasing this developer list before, where the developers were getting robocalls, they were getting cold calls because our developer list got into the wrong hands. So we feel comfortable sharing it with Eversource because we're protected.
Okay, great. So thank you for the discussion. I do have a few questions, and I think I'm trying to decide if they should be handled before or after the break. So I think I'll tackle one subject before the break, and I'll leave the second one for after. But my question is on the in-service DER and whether they should be considered eligible NWS resources. We discussed this a little at the June 20th tech meeting, but I really just want to get a general sense of whether there is really any good like technical or engineering basis for kind of broadly excluding in-service DER from bidding into the process.
So basically, the question is front of the meter, say a battery system that's on a substation already to participate. So there are some considerations we have to take into this. So say, and a battery it is again, there's a 5 megawatt battery in our substation. The way this battery gets interconnected is that the company will take a look at on the interconnection process what that battery adds in terms of load. So it's a 5 megawatt battery. If that's an uncurtailed battery that can charge at any point in time, we will study it as a 5 megawatt charge at any point in time. And when that battery signs its interconnection service agreement, we know that that capacity is basically quote unquote reserved for that battery. So say we have 50 megawatts on the station peak, the 5 megawatt battery comes in. If we do the next interconnection study of say a warehouse, then we take the peak, we know that the batteries, then even if the battery wasn't charging on peak last year, we account for that load, say, oh, it's 50 megawatt was peak. We know we have that battery that can charge at peak. Nobody's preventing it from doing it. So now it's 55, the load gets interconnected. So now we create a constraint on the system, right? So we've just created a constraint because the substation only has 56 megawatts and the new warehouse goes above and beyond that step load that's forecasted. And we talk about step load forecasting in the IDSP docket extensively, but that starts triggering an upgrade. Now, the battery can basically come to us and say, oh, great, I'll promise not to charge and you pay me for it. So they're part of the problem and then get paid for solving it. That's the problem in this discussion. Generally speaking, yes, if there are flexible assets that can be you can procure services from. That's the general concept of using a DERMS system. And in Massachusetts, we have a concept that was just approved in the ESMP, the Grid Services Compensation Fund, where we pay for services from assets. But you have to be very careful in that distinction that you don't end up with assets causing system constraints and then double dipping by bidding back into the NWA process and getting paid for resolving the problems they've caused.
I guess maybe I don't quite see how that scenario is different than like a demand response where, my summer load, my peak capacity is causing part of the demand constraint and I'm getting paid to reduce my load during the constrained period. So I'm just curious about, where you see the difference on that.
I would put the difference in the type of assets we're looking at. One is the customers that we have to serve, so general residential customers, commercial customers, that it's our statutory obligation to provide power service to, and the battery is an investment vehicle that somebody can place there to maximize profits. And so knowing that, if I'm a savvy developer, I can double play the system. The battery doesn't appear somewhere because somebody wants to build a house somewhere and live there or open a business. That's an investment vehicle. So I think that's the distinction where I see that difference, that front of the meter battery is going to be placed precisely to earn a revenue at a certain level.
So you're not talking about behind the meter batteries, just in front of the meter?
Yes, so that was basically, that's the front of meter asset, sorry. Should have clarified. We have response programs for behind the meter, yes.
Okay, interesting. So does the company think that there are any ways to kind of remediate that problem through the solicitation process? Yeah.
It's an interesting question. I don't necessarily have a good answer at this point. I'm going to refer back to what I just mentioned in Massachusetts. Through the ESMP, we've just been granted this opportunity to set up a grid service compensation fund that is slated to explore these opportunities, to figure out what is the possibility of using existing assets on the system, What's the value? What can you pay them? What will cause them to change their current dispatches? Right? These assets might already be in market contracts. They might have other purposes. So that's being explored right now. TBD on the results.
Okay, great. Right, and so then kind of as a follow-up to this discussion, it seems like there might be some issues with allowing in-service DER, but there might also be some advantages in terms of maybe cost, timelines, interconnection issues. So I'd be interested in hearing from folks about whether they think there are advantages to allowing these resources to fit into the process.
Well, as I mentioned, I think the advantage you mentioned, right? Turnaround time is pretty quick. If you already have a battery position there and you want to bid it into the process as an ideal scenario, it goes quick. But again, caveat what I mentioned earlier, you create opportunities that you might not want to be creating. So if that was part of the process, a lot of thought would have to go into how to structure this to ensure that these assets aren't being purposefully placed and then next year bid into the NWS process.
Yeah, I guess another benefit from my perspective would be it's likely cheaper to get an asset to change kind of its value, its function, and an existing battery to change its function than to purpose build a battery, get a battery that's already built to kind of change its change what it's doing, what it's contributing to the grid, compared to building something from scratch.
That's under some assumption, I think that's correct. But I do want to say just very quickly one thing, just so we know what like context we're talking about here, right? Again, from last time's discussion, the small projects, the $300,000 project, the circuit, we're very likely not going to find a battery already in place at some random circuit. Right? This is in all practicality, we're talking about substation upgrades here, where it's a substation upgrade that gets triggered, and that substation somewhere in that service territory, there is already a battery, for example. That could be anything else, but that's the level that we're talking about. That's the big projects, because the small ones have small service territories behind them, and thus a very low likelihood that you're going to find something that is there already. The other thing then, of course, into this discussion, and I'm not reopening this, but it does tie back into the ownership discussion in the morning, right? If there's an existing battery, that would fit into this, again, tying this back to earlier, our proposed would be yes, and then we buy that asset from that owner, essentially. That would then be an option to buy that asset that already exists.
Tom Wheel from OCC again. I would just add, I think I do understand, at least from our perspective, Dr. Walker's point, we wouldn't want to see kind of double dipping. Like we wouldn't want to see assets that have already been supported by ratepayer dollars through a different program, sort of having the advantage of getting further ratepayer dollar support through a different program. But I think that's resolvable through some sort of regulation, but it's an important point to keep in mind. But I think the question, I mean, it might be true that something like a DER asset isn't likely to qualify, but I think from my perspective, if it does, like if a pre-existing asset that's in place is a candidate to meet a non-wires need in a way that makes sense for them to if at the end of this process, it would make sense to go with that bid if the benefit cost analysis shakes out. I don't see why it should be a barrier as long as there are kind of protections in place to make sure that there aren't perverse incentives or that people aren't benefiting from perverse incentives.
Yeah. And so I entirely agree with Real, right? I'm not saying this is impossible. I'm just saying it has to be really thought through. And just to drive the whole point home on thinking this through, right? You could have a battery that's already doing a certain dispatch schedule. Under that NWS program, that dispatch schedule would then have to be different, right? Because if it still remains to be the same, because say the battery is discharging at peak load, and we would be discharging it at peak load. The battery's operation hasn't changed, so you've just made a profit on doing nothing, essentially changing anything. Right? So if the battery essentially has been discharging at peak load and we have a system constraint, you can't bid it in because you're already lowering the load on the system as it is.
Right, right. And so, but then you would be assuming that about the battery's operation, which I understand, I think you've said before, you'd be sort of assuming that the battery is discharging at peak load when you evaluate the
Yes.
system need, correct?
So for the forecast, yes, we do evaluate that. I'm just saying that the battery, the complication about the battery is you have a plus minus band that you're operating in. And so for interconnections, we assume them always to be discharging unless they are under our control, right? If they are under our control, that of course looks entirely different and we can assume different things. But for merchant assets, the ISO prices can spike any time of day, right? So they can charge and discharge anytime. So we assume charging at all times, discharging at all times for interconnection and charging at all times for the load forecast. That's basically the baseline assumption.
Okay, interesting. And I do have a final question on this topic for the process monitor. I'm just curious if you're aware of how this issue is treated in other jurisdictions.
Do you have a sense of that? You mean the issue of whether existing assets can bid?
Correct.
I'm not aware of other jurisdictions that exclude that. I think I agree. I'm not I'm not aware of any like actual examples where it's implemented. I agree it's probably a relatively unlikely scenario, but I'm not aware of anything that that like actively excludes that as a possibility.
Yeah, that's my understanding, at least. State of Rhode Island, for example, is that, this hasn't really come up, but they're not explicitly excluded from using in-service DERs.
Okay, great. Thank you. So then I might just open it up to see if there are any final questions from any participants on the topics we've discussed, and then we'll take our break.
Thank you, Mr. Butler. I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Arconti for a second. I think between him and I, we had a question, a clarifying question for Eversource based on an earlier portion of the conversation, not to reopen the larger conversation on the ownership structure, but have a clarifying question before the break.
Yeah, and I'm hoping this is just a very, very simple clarification question on the ownership model, just for our purposes, my purposes here, and my notes as well. So I'm looking for as concise. I'm going to ask it in hopes, I think it's as close to a yes or no answer as possible. Third-party ownership for front-of-the-meter grid operator resources, bad. Third-party ownership behind-the-meter resources, okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And to follow up on that distinction, is it because there is no instance in which in your opinion, the front of the meter asset is going to serve as anything other than a reliability, and you're making the distinction that you don't want those to serve for the reliability need?
Yeah, I think the distinction is more in the fact that how these assets end up in the bid process. So as acting as a non-wires alternative. So as an example, you have a 3 or 4 megawatt deficiency on a substation. So one bid could be to equip 500 homes with Tesla Powerwalls and control them through a demand response program. So let me take that. The behind the meter batteries, they would be owned and operated, owned by the homeowners, right? They get subsidies for it or whatever the benefits are, they own the battery. And then there is the demand response system. That's the control and execution. We would be doing control and execution. So they'd be plugging into our demand response system. So we'd have the control and execution of when they show up. Now, the difference to the front of the meter asset is that there's 500 of them. So if 50 don't show up, are empty, broken, circuit breaker out, or whatever it is, we will assume not 500 available for the non-wires, but when that bid comes in, maybe we need 350 to address the need. So we will say, okay, it needs to be 500, so we have a buffer zone in there, so we can, some of them don't need to appear. So that's how we're managing that portion of the ownership and readiness of the asset through the numbers of the asset. And that's possible on behind the meter. Front of the meter, it's going to be one large 3 megawatt battery. we don't have that option because it's just one battery. So there's a binary show or show no show scenario. And that's why we are saying we need the ownership of the asset to make sure that asset is in working and operating conditions at all times, charged and ready to go. That's the distinction.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So it's not so much about the use case, but behind the meter, front of the meter. So just to drill down onto that point, the behind the meter in that example, is the RFP going to publish what Eversource's like discount rate is for how many batteries you need to show up, home behind the meter batteries to show up, so that the bidder knows how many they should be putting in there?
So I don't think that's been discussed or contemplated at this point. That's definitely something we can talk about. But I would also argue that, you know, if such a vendor, battery name brand battery behind the meter producers, without naming anybody here specifically, they have very good data themselves on how these batteries occur. So I would always encourage them to go into the bid and say, you know, based on data we have from the 10 million behind the meter batteries we have in the system, if an event occurs, we see 80% participation, 75% participation. We're going to put a 5% security margin on that, call it 70. We're bidding in this much. So can definitely be contemplated. I don't see a problem with providing at least a train of thought of how the utility is looking at this in the bid, but that shouldn't exclude the bidder from using the data they have on the systems they're proposing and the participation as an input into the bid.
Okay, that's helpful. So said another way, like,
Open for negotiation.
Oh, yeah, sure. But the respondent would have the opportunity to provide you data saying, okay, well, you wanted 500 megawatts. I'm only offering, 510 because my data shows that we'll have a 10 megawatt attrition. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Do we want to take our break?
Yes.
Okay. So let's take our break. I think we're right on schedule. So we'll come back at 10:50, please.
Thank you.
sign in, Albert?
Oh, you gotta sign in?
I'm not sure. I think they know who we are, but.
What's that? Safety log, safety and security.
I'll sign you in.
When did this start happening?
I forgot, we did it like the first one of these in KBR.
I have never signed. I have been
This is only the second time that I did that. Yeah, that's the only reason I thought might be worth doing.
And people knew you were here. I don't know if that. I mean, you know,
I'll be right back at 40 minutes.
I guess so. Oh, way too soon.
I'm usually like the last one back here.
Saw that reversal. Back to.
Okay, welcome back. We will go back on the record and I'll turn it back to Mr. Butler, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair Gillette. Thanks everyone again for the discussion today. We might wait just a minute. Sounds good. We'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, thank you everyone again for the discussion this morning. Before we actually move on to our second topic, wanted to kind of wrap up on one of the last topics around in the RFP. And that's regarding the interconnection treatment of the NWS projects. So I think the EDCs are kind of best situated to handle the first question, which I really just am trying to get a sense of how much it might be even an issue, the interconnection treatment of the NWS projects. So if I'm wondering if anyone from the Eversource or UI team kind of has a general sense of how long the queues are at the substations that would likely be included in these annual filings. And yeah, how often this might come up as an issue where a technically feasible and cost beneficial NWS might not be selected because it couldn't complete the interconnection process in time to address the grid need.
So that's a good question. And the interconnection process is different in different parts. I mean, different interconnection queue, sorry, is different in different parts of the state. As you know, the eastern and the north portion of the state and northwest Connecticut, we see a lot more DER activity. The queue at some of those stations could be pretty long. We have stations with, 50, 60, 70 megawatts in queue. And so if the NWA is in that substation, it could be a significant wait to get interconnected. So it could impact. And what would become more of a factor is as we move forward with the non-residential cost allocation process, if that does kick off and we develop capital investment projects or interconnection projects for groups of DER at those stations that take a while to build, that could even create more delay, because if it's taking 2, 3, 4 years to create that group study solution, then everything in the queue would be on hold until those are interconnected. So we do have a current problem, and depending on how the cost allocation process goes, it could be a little bit more protracted.
Okay, any other stakeholders want to comment on the Eversource statements here?
Just to add quickly one thing, I think, and don't quote me on the exact number, but I think after 3 megawatts, you might, under certain conditions, you also qualify for the 1 megawatt. You also qualify for the ISO interconnection queue, right? So that's an entirely different thing. And even if we were to consider, I think I'm guessing where you're going with this is on the skipping the queue for the NWA projects. That would be outside of our jurisdiction as the utilities to influence that queue. So if, for example, a 5 megawatt storage system goes in, they also have to go through transmission interconnection study, even if they're connected to the distribution grid. So, skipping the distribution queue doesn't actually buy you time.
Right. Okay. And sorry, could you say again the megawatt cutoff there? Was it?
It's 1 megawatt for the ISO, the I-39 process. Any DER that's 1 megawatt above would be considered for the ISO process. It could be level 0, where it's review, or level 3, where it's an actual study. But if it's 1 megawatt and above, it does get wrapped up in that process. And because the ISO now they've changed their process where they're now doing cluster studies and grouping all the DER in those affected system operator studies together. We've seen that the first cluster, which will probably kick off sometime in October, could take about 2 years. And so any DER that would be up for application after the October timeframe, they would have to wait at least 2 years to get into the next ISO cluster study. And that does create an immediate delay issue.
And I think, correct me again on the number, Mr. Freeman, at 5 megawatts, you automatically are type 3.
No choice, yes.
Yeah, you're at 5 megawatts, level 3, so that means you're going through the full interconnection. And I do believe the utilities also left that as part of their comments, just basically, when we talked last time, we had like the lower cap, like, how many dollars, what years should qualify in WA. We're also said like there's an upper cap on this if the deficiency on the system is too large. And we proposed the 5 megawatt limit to say if on the 10-year forecast we're larger than 5 megawatts deficiency, then we will opt for, we're proposing that the process automatically opts for the traditional solution, because any DER or other project solution is very likely to run into issues on the interconnection queue. So that's the upper limit there.
Yeah, I would just to add, this is the case that we might incur doing any interconnection of a DER. However, there's the possibility of the waiver on the ISO, because the idea of this regulation is there are clusters, there are places that there are so many DERs that are impacting the transmission. And that's why ISO put this regulation into place. So we need to inform every 1 mega and above, but is the possibility of having a waiver to not go through their studies if we are the DR to be interconnected is not on a, let's say, a red cluster, a red region, and if it needs to go through what Mr. Lavelle said about the levels and the type of studies, and if it's a major upgrade to be made on the transmission, will take years to accomplish.
Okay, thank you. And so just kind of a clarifying question then, the company would take the interconnection queue length into consideration when evaluating the RFP?
Yes.
Okay. So referring back again to the battery storage pilot proposals in docket 220605, first question is, so if those projects were approved, would the company essentially enter those projects into the interconnection queue, or would they interconnect them outside of the normal interconnection process?
I'll let Mr. Freeman answer this one.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, Mr. Butler?
Yeah, definitely. So if those projects were to be approved, my question is if Eversource would essentially put those projects in the interconnection queue, or would the company process those outside of the interconnection queue?
Company-owned projects?
Yeah, the pilot proposals in 220605. Would the company interconnect those through the interconnection queue? In other words, put those in the queue, wait for all the developers who are already in the queue to complete their projects and then interconnect those projects? Or would they prioritize the interconnection of the pilot proposals in that docket?
So currently, based on the state tariff that we have to comply with, we cannot prioritize a project over another project that's in the queue. And we do have really strict rules that we need to follow. And so for us to do that, there needs to be some modification of the tariff to allow us to do that.
Okay, understood. And so I think my question is really about the pilot projects in docket 220605.
Yeah.
So if those were approved, how would the company interconnect those projects?
I'm sorry, yeah, so those projects would go through the interconnection process, just like any other project owned by a third party.
And so they would essentially wait in the interconnection queue until a lot of other third-party developers interconnect their projects, and then eventually Eversource would sort of arrive at its place in the queue.
That is correct.
Okay.
And if I may, it was an example that just happened with UI, with the Pleasure Beach project. It needed to go through the interconnection queue to be able to start rolling. So we passed the project through the queue.
Yeah, so just one clarification on the terminology is that we wait till everybody else has interconnected. And they're studied in order, right? So if somebody has a 2-year delay in building their DER, we won't wait until they're done, as long as we're studied in that order. And that study order is observed. And if one project then is actually the one that was studied last is faster in building, they can go first, just to make sure that it's the order of study, not the order of actually physically being built.
Well, yes and no, not to contradict my colleague, but if a project was studied before and an upgrade for that project was required for the next project to be interconnected, then that would have to be built first, or the second project would have to pay for that upgrade. So that's it. But if they're not upgrades, then Dr. Walker is absolutely correct. We can proceed to build and connect out of order.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are definitely helpful clarifications. Another question I have is those projects will also undergo the ISO New England interconnection process and study process. Is that correct?
That is correct. Each of those projects are over 1 megawatt. I think there were 2 or 2.5 megawatts, and the third was 6 megawatts, I think. So they would go to the ISO I39 process also. But one of the key factors with those projects, at least in the way we selected them, I think at least 2 of them, the queue wasn't significantly long. The one in Campbell, there's a substantial queue at Campbell, if I'm not mistaken. But the Rocky River has a substantial queue. It's Campbell and Frybrook. And so at least one of them would not be caught up in an extensive queue delay. The others possibly could, yes.
Okay, and so which one of them would not be caught up in it?
It's so Frybrook has a queue. Campbell, I think, does not have a substantial queue.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Okay, and then I guess I have kind of a question about how whether this problem sort of ever occurs for basically load growth driven upgrades. So I mean, specifically my question really is just whether it's ever the case that a developer's project needs to be reevaluated because the company determines that it needs to upgrade a substation to accommodate load growth or a reliability need.
So I'll start off, and then Mr. Freeman can chime in. So let's start with a very large project, and just referring back to the IDSP docket, these get tracked on our side in the step load tracking. And if the customer communicates with us early on and ahead of time, right, these step loads end up in the company's forecast, and the company can accommodate that on the capacity side. So technically, by the time the project's there should not be any issues in terms of the capacity if that has been clearly communicated ahead of time.
And one of the key things that we don't have that we actually contemplated is one queue. We don't have a single queue for DER load. And this is particularly relevant for battery storage, where battery storage acts like a large load. And so battery storage at a substation could really disadvantage load. And so we're part of we've put some controls in place with regard to how we design systems, the size of battery storage that's allowed on a distribution feeder or the circuit. And the point of that is to allow sufficient capacity and operational flexibility so as not to disadvantage large projects, especially maybe smaller projects, mom and pop shops. So the battery wouldn't hold hostage all the capacity. But what Dr. Walker said is completely correct.
Okay, awesome. And so I would invite any other stakeholders to maybe comment on this issue. But if not, I think all set on that, and I'll be ready to kind of move on to our next topic. Okay, looks like we're all set. Laura, could you go to the next slide after that? Thank you. Okay, so I'll just jump into a quick overview of the EDC developed materials. The REO7 decision and design document specified that several key NWS materials would be developed by the EDCs during the process initiation phase. These materials include a standard cybersecurity data access policy and pre-approval process, which includes non-disclosure agreements and data security agreements that specify vendor security requirements. The standard RFP to be issued by the EDCs for an NWS solicitation inclusive of any processes to screen and qualify bidders, and the pro forma contract for NWS bidders to execute with the EDC upon selection, including performance criteria and an evaluation, measurement, and verification plan. Also, as a result of the process initiation phase, additional materials were added, including a respondent checklist and an NWS questionnaire. So the subject of the discussion for this second session is really whether stakeholders have any concerns with the EDC materials, whether any modifications should be made, and also to discuss the process monitor's findings and recommendations on the task 3 and task 7. So I will give everyone an opportunity to make an opening statement on this issue, and I will start with the Eversource team.
I'm going to be very short on this one because I think I already said a lot on the first topic that does come up here again on the EPC agreement and the RFP template. So I think for most of the rest, there's pretty much consensus between the utilities and the process monitor. So nothing more to add here.
I echo what Mr. Walker just referenced. I believe the only outstanding item in terms of the EDC developed materials has to do with the performer contract and the ownership model. I believe everything else we've received feedback on, and we've integrated the edits we've received. Thank you.
It's Adrian Caesar with the process monitor. We believe the only other substantive point of feedback the process monitor had was related to the EM&V plan that was described in the design document. At least in review of draft materials, we noticed that the pro forma contract didn't include language around an EM&V plan, so we wanted to make sure that those provisions were included in the final pro forma contract.
Hi, again, Tom Wheel from OCC. We didn't have any concerns with any of these items. I guess I am a little confused about whether for EDCs or EDCs affiliates, if they're bidding a project, like whether the plan is that they'd receive all the same material. I guess as a general statement, I'm still like a little hazy on how the participation of the EDCs or EDC affiliates, if there's any difference for them generally, but I guess with respect to this slide, whether there's any difference for sort of what they'd receive. Okay, got it. And maybe the Eversource team, if you'd like a chance to respond to the process monitor's comments, I'd give you that opportunity. Otherwise, I've really only got one additional question.
I don't have any specific comments on that. I think we received the feedback, but Marissa, you want anything else to say on the EMV side?
We did comment on the EMV in our written comments, I believe, and the EMV plan will be within the developer's contract. However, it was not part of the pro forma contract because it's usually customized to the technology being proposed. So that's why it wasn't part of the pro forma contract template, but we will have one.
Yeah, and from our perspective, we agree, and that makes sense. It is going to be significantly different depending on what the solution is. When you're talking, could be batteries, could be demand response. Obviously the specifics of the EM&V plan will be different, but you still need one.
Okay, great. And so I had a question about the additional materials that were added during the process initiation phase, and I'm just wondering if stakeholders could just give a little bit of detail about the the contractor checklist and the NWS questionnaire and what the rationale was for developing those additional materials and, yeah.
So those two items actually came from the process monitor after they developed, after they reviewed all our materials, they came back and said, you know, it would be great, and please correct me if I'm wrong here. It would be great if there was a respondent checklist to make sure that the developers submitting the proposals and spending so much time developing their proposals, they have a quick checklist to ensure their proposals are complete. And then the last item, the NWS questionnaire, it's a very comprehensive document that outlines all the different specs on each type of technology that we can receive through the NWS bidding process. So that is to help mitigate any back and forth with the developer and really just help expedite the review process.
Okay, great, understood. And I think another question I have is just maybe giving stakeholders an opportunity to weigh in on the questions posed by Attorney Wheel. And Attorney Wheel, maybe you could restate those really quick.
Sure. I was just curious. It's my understanding that the EDCs or EDC affiliates are eligible to bid it in projects through this process. So I was just wondering if there's any difference whether, and maybe the EDCs already have a practice for, like, if they issue an RFP for which their own affiliates are eligible, I was just curious if there's any difference at all in sort of the materials that are distributed or developed for the process, like specific to those bidders.
So just very briefly, I think that standard bid procedure information that's given to one bidder must be made available to all bidders. So if an affiliate of the company were to bid in, they would have exactly access to the same information as everybody else.
And just to chime in there, UI's affiliates, our compliance department actually reached out to our affiliates, and none of them are interested in bidding into our NWS projects.
Did this, Steve Capozzi with Authority Staff, did this question come up at all during the initiation phase? And was it, or, you know, did you think through some of the trade-offs for this, or if there's, you know, any?
Yeah, some of this is actually relevant to our findings and research under Task 4, which related to codes of conduct for EDC affiliates. And essentially our findings from that were that, you know, again, any EDC affiliate participating in this process would be subject to all state and federal regulations that are applicable, and also to the prescribed, you know, procurement practices, again, just to ensure a fair and just procurement process.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone very much for the discussion. We don't have any further questions on this topic, so I might give stakeholders a final opportunity to make any additional comments before I make final statement. Yep.
Yeah, so if that's okay with staff and the commissioners and the chair, we have Mr. Lee, who heads up our cybersecurity. And especially as we're looking at the first points, the data access and vendor security requirements, I think he's brought some very interesting topics that we just very quickly like to discuss.
Thank you. Christopher Lee, Eversource Chief Information Security Officer. Through this whole process, I commend everyone as to the seriousness of taking cyber. It's a concern, and everyone understands that. My comments really are around the threat landscape right now and how it impacts what's going on. We've baked into this process various controls and procedures to evaluate who's bidding, who wants to go and work on these projects, make sure they're tall enough that, as we say, take this ride and go, because they have sufficient controls. There are no guarantees in cybersecurity. If anyone thinks that what we've laid out will guarantee no one can get hacked anywhere, that's a misnomer. So we all need to understand that. So we need to understand that these are the fiduciary responsibilities, industry standard controls to ensure that everyone is working at the level they should for the nature of the data. That being said, and it also goes along with this morning's conversation, the current threat landscape is that our nation states are trying to acquire companies. I have a Homeland Security report in front of me right now that can be made available under protections. that specifically states nation states are trying to acquire critical infrastructure type companies with the intent to either steal intellectual property or to have management influence over what they're doing. We have an evaluation process that we've worked through to try to vet some of these risks out, but it specifically has examples where countries have gone 3, 4, 5 shell companies deep in order to hide their tracks and still own some of these companies. It specifically even states that foreign adversaries will adapt tactics to avoid law enforcement detection of intellectual property, take it to the intent to manage the organization and make decision-making. So this is the reality. When we think about the ownership of some of these these items that we're going to be building here, today it might be a US-based company, tomorrow it could be someone who's been acquired. We have to ensure that we understand if they buy them out later on, they may not be operating, as was discussed earlier. They may choose to operate them maliciously. And that's just the reality we're living in. So as we decide who do we allow to own these companies, this is the reality of what we're living in. We have examples right now across the country where nation states are building and acquiring data centers for cryptocurrency, for artificial intelligence purposes, and the part of the risk that's being looked at right now within the federal government and the industry is if they modify those computing systems, what does that do to the grid? How can that, because they use so much electricity, they shut a third of the system down, how much of an impact do we have? This is a valid risk that is being looked at right now because nation states are doing it. It's public information that China does not allow crypto data centers in the country of China, but they're building them here. There's a reason for that. And so we just have to understand and be aware that we have very good controls and procedures we've developed. As we decide, do we allow ownership? And not just, it's foreign ownership is not necessarily a bad thing. It's certain countries are bad things. This is the risk that we're in right now. And I don't see that changing. Homeland Security's been commenting on this for quite a while. So I just encourage the commission and everyone to be aware of this as we're thinking about which way we're going and making decisions. This is the landscape that we can do. And if anyone is ever interested in Homeland Security doing a briefing on this, it's a very easy request to have, and they can come in and talk to this on their side. But I do have their report that can be provided. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Just a couple, the company, so with outside of the non-wires process, the vendors that the company works with, do you do the ownership, evaluation of the ownership? Okay.
We attempt to find that out. Yes.
Okay. Is that similar to what was proposed in these documents?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. For the process monitor, have you compared how the security requirements compare to maybe with other jurisdictions? And even UI where you operate in, in New York, security requirements, can you talk a little bit about how they compare?
Yes, so we found that they were consistent with what we've seen in other jurisdictions. As part of the process, we actually had to go through a pretty similar document we had to fill out, going through with our IT department to ensure that we're doing SOC testing and different forms of IT compliance, but it is pretty similar with what we've seen in other places.
Very good, thank you.
Just to answer your question, so these documents, we actually, they're industry standards, so we use what works and what we've learned from New York and from Maine, and actually use those lessons learned here to help inform the NWS program in Connecticut, to hopefully make it best in class.
Okay, thank you. Those are all the questions I have. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So if no participants have any Mr. Rossetti?
For the final message, right? The final message?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, no, actually, it's an idea that came to my mind when the Chairman Gillette mentioned about how to integrate all those individuals that might have the Tesla batteries on their homes. One suggestion is to there on the IES program, there's a phase 1, there's this company called Piccolo that is working with us and Eversource, and it's a project sponsored by Pura. So they have this platform to serve as a marketplace for people that want to sell services, energy and grid services, and for us as service contractors, let's say, to hire those services through their platforms. So in the discussions that we are having with them, I always mention to them that they should be well versed and involved on these process here, on the NWS process, because it's the only way, the formal way that the ADCs could purchase any, let's say, grid services. So for the sake of integrating all the things that are being done here in the state, I think they are a good stakeholder. Not sure to participate on here, but definitely join us on the stakeholder meeting hosted by the program monitor. So just the suggestion to have them more involved here with us. I think it will add value for what we want to build here.
And I apologize, there was just one other comment to make on this. Currently today, and I'm pretty sure Avangrid's in the same boat in this side. We do not have third parties running equipment that's inside of our grid. So stay front of the meter side. No, I want to stay on, not behind the meter. There are no third parties that runs anything and then has access to our environment, because those devices are inside the network. When we build things and we hire a third party to maintain something, they come in through our remote access systems. We found folks trying to set up remote access to battery systems that were not authorized, and it was plugged into the internet. We need to ensure that these folks are coming in the right way, or as I've seen with wind farms down in Texas just recently, you plug it into the internet, it gets hacked with ransomware, you lose visibility. So we do not currently allow access into our network just by plugging in. There has to be specific procedures and controls. So that just adds to this risk factor of, are they on the network or not? So if they're going to own it, manage it, build it, we have to just be aware of that piece of it. We don't have third parties doing that now. And if we have to go down that path, there will be additional cost that has to be done to manage that and protect our environment from what they may have on their side. So there is a cost factor in here that has to be evaluated. Every situation is different, but has to be considered. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for the discussion. Before we close out, I want to remind everyone that we have a final technical meeting on October 1st to discuss the benefit cost analysis framework. So looking forward to that discussion. In the meantime, stakeholders are encouraged to file any comments on today's discussion in the proceeding. And so that's it for me. I'll turn it over to you, Chair Gillette.
Thank you. Let me just echo Mr. Butler's appreciation for everyone's attendance this morning, and we will see you on October 1st. Thank you.
Thank you.